Welcome to California in Focus. I'm Keegan Kernodle. Joining me today is the Center Square's LA-based reporter, Kenneth Schrupp. Now, Kenneth wrote recently on California's brush clearance efforts stalling. Can you tell us more about this, Kenneth?
Hey, Keegan. So it's been 9 months since the devastating January wildfires caused an estimated hundreds of billions of dollars of economic damage in the Los Angeles area. And so I've conducted an investigation into what the state is doing to make sure that we don't see something like that happen again. And we have some pretty interesting results. There is a executive order the governor signed on March 1st that is supposed to create this new streamlined approvals process for brush clearance projects. By October 9th, there were 140 projects approved through this new pathway. And of those, I was able to find data for 131. So everything is in the context of that. Of those 131 projects that have been approved since that March order, only 7 are complete. And those added up to 70 acres. The thing is that those 131 projects were add up to 30,159 and a half acres, which if you look at the number of acres approved to the number of completed, acres in the projects reported as completed, more on that later, it's only about 0.2%, which is a very low number. It's also worth noting though, that about half of the acres of approved projects are underway. That is, they are, those projects have started, but we don't know how many acres within those projects underway are complete. So when I say 0.2% are done, that's with a grain of salt. That's of the projects that are completely done. Obviously, some of these larger projects that are, 1,000 acres, those are going to take more time. But still, you would think that we would have more than 7 of those projects done about 9 months after the fire. I also looked at a separate set of data that is looking at this major brush clearance project through Cal Fire. And at least this is a project that is overseen by Cal Fire. I believe that they entities can apply for grants through them, and Cal Fire administers the grants. But regardless, there is this Cal Fire dashboard of brush clearance and this wildfire risk reduction projects that are being done in the state. And they show a decline over the previous year. And again, this is initial preliminary data. It's like crime data, right? Crime data in real time. If someone is saying, oh, crime is down in the last few months, you don't really necessarily know that until maybe the next year because that data is subject to adjustment. Reporting periods can lag. People might not report the crime on time. It's the same thing kind of applies here, right? This is preliminary data, but it can still provide some insight into what might be happening. And what we see is that the monthly average of projects being done is down, right? We had 128 per month in this 128 active projects on average, reporting activity this year through July, August, and September. Meanwhile, over that same period last year, there were 165. So there's been a decline of about 22%. Again, this is preliminary, subject to change. Could be updated later as reporting periods change, but it might not be growing as much as we think. We don't know. We will actually see about a year from now, but based on preliminary data, it is looking like we're not getting the kind of brush clearance that people would have expected after such a major disaster created so much damage in the state in such a visible way. I also did, though, speak to a lot of experts and a lot of state officials about this. One of them was in San Luis Obispo, which had the highest concentration of these expedited projects. And it does seem like, the exemption process is creating a lot of these projects that have been held up for years are finally getting approval. How long it ultimately takes for these projects to be done is another question. But yes, it is clear that these exemptions are helping. But again, why there are questions as to why, if this exemption program could have been created at any time, why was it only created now? There's also the question of, okay, well, if there was if we had a lot more money and we were willing to fund all of these programs that the state wants to do, would the state still be able to properly manage the land that it has? Let's just say even, we're multiplying, the current amount of work that's being done by 10. And because the state is so large and because there is so much forest, scrubland, there's one expert I talked to, Edward Ring at the California Policy Center, who said there's really no way for the state to reach its goal of brush clearance and forest management effectively without really working with people who are ranchers, timber companies, and conducting more prescribed burns. The timber companies in California, we've seen a major decline in the timber industry across the last few decades. And we do have pretty strict rules on how timber companies do operate. But where they do operate, we do see much better forest management, right? They want to protect the investment of this lease on this land, or if they're leasing it from the government or if they've purchased it. Either way, they want to make sure they're getting their money's worth out of their investments. So that's one possible way. It would also create revenue for the state. The other is, and you see this in a lot of the rest of the country, is the state could provide grazing rights. I believe the federal government actually charges money for these grazing rights. So when you have sheep, goats, cows, and depending on the terrain, you're going to have different kinds of animals that be good at and, want to eat the plant material that's there. You would have a way of, again, creating revenue for the state, but also managing the risk of wildfire. And of course, prescribed burns are something that we hear talked about a lot. There's obviously some risk always of a fire going out of control from a prescribed burn, but it does seem like that risk is much lower than what happens when no prescribed burns are done and there simply just aren't the personnel, funding, and equipment to do these alternative, hand tool or mechanical thinning operations that a lot of efforts seem to focus on. Just for context, though, researchers estimate that about 1.8 million acres of California land burned every year before 1800. And with the state about 42.2 million hectares large, this means that the equivalent of the entire state burned every 23 years. So, like all of these discussions about, a few 100,000 acres, here and there, that has to be put in the context of, we have a massive state and we have a lot of land that normally burned, and we have an environment that is, in plant life, that is based on these rapid burn cycles. So if we're not doing prescribed burns, if we're not actually doing manual management of some kind, whether we're doing it with animals, we're doing it with tools and machines, whether it's timber companies, then we should not be surprised if we see burns and wildfires make up for this forest suppression, make up for this policy of combined not really doing a lot of wildfire risk management, but also focusing on something called wildfire suppression. Wildfire suppression is when you're really focused on putting out any fire as soon as it starts. But if you combine that with not doing the basic brush clearance, doing the basic risk reduction, then you end up with a massive tinderbox, and that is where we are.
Well, thank you, Kenneth, for your reporting on this. I know you'll have more stories touching on the areas of this as well, and listeners can keep up with those at thecentersquare.com. For now, thank you for listening to California in Focus.